So I'm hoping this is on. Is it on? Can you hear me? Great. I am bereft of PowerPoint, as you can see. Normally when I come up in front of people, there's a piano, and even when I talk, I play a little bit, but we couldn't get a piano in here. So I'm going to do my best. I may tap dance, tell jokes, who knows. But the theme, People of the Book, is particularly apropos to the ideas I want to share with you today. Because one of the main interests that I've had is the idea of a developing Jewish narrative in the United States. So I'd like to expand this definition of people of the book, because at the heart of every book, of course, is a story. So I want to talk about the people of the story, the narrative. Now, it's common parlance to say the greatest story ever told was the Bible or the Torah. And clearly, that's the case. Because when you consider the number of lives that have been created and lost with that book as a subtext, it is the greatest story ever told. And beyond that, the Jewish experience is built on a story. One of the subtexts of Steve Nadler's talk yesterday, How to Read the Bible, Spinoza versus Maimonides, hinted at something similar. And that is really the existence of God, or the quality of the existence of God. According to Spinoza, God could be equated with nature. Well, is that saying anything then, just that there's a different word? So I like to start by saying either God exists or she does not. And if God exists, then clearly that's a miracle. If there's a single, all-knowing consciousness being somewhere that not only knows what's in all of our minds and hearts, but in the minds and hearts of every creature all throughout the universe, that's a miracle. But if God does not exist, then God is just a story. And if God is just a story, that means we worship a story. So that tells you the power of narrative, specifically in the Jewish tradition. So, having said that, the importance of the narrative is going to be a thread through my remarks. Now, my remarks are going to come at you more as a midrash than a formal lecture. That's what I do as a jazz musician. I improvise, and I'm going to do that today. The theme of the Jewish narrative is roughly translated as social justice. Social justice, tikkun olam, healing the world, the golden rule, treat others as you wish to be treated yourself. That's it. That's the core of the Jewish narrative. Now, the thrust of my remarks today are going to be on the relationship of blacks and Jews in America, and how we can see through the lens of popular music not only what is the nature of the relationship, but how it's evolved over the 20th century. I told a friend yesterday, she said, "What are you going to talk about?" I said, "Well, the relationship of blacks and Jews in America." She said, "Oh, well, you didn't want to take on anything difficult, I see." But it's particularly important to consider that in terms of popular culture in America. Because without the Jews and without the African Americans, there would be no popular culture in America. There was no American popular culture before the blacks and the Jews. What? Well, let's go back to the early part of the 19th century. And I don't mean to digress too far, but it's important to have a sense of the context of America when the Jews arrived. Again, as Steve Nadler said yesterday, the context is very important in understanding the meaning. In the 1830s, America received a large number of Irish who were fleeing the Great Potato Famine. And, you know, up until that time, the bulk of the American immigrants were, of course, Anglo-Saxons, Germans, Northern Europeans by and large. The Irish, historically, were the blacks of the United Kingdom. The Black Irish is an expression, but beyond that, you had the whole discussion of Papists versus Anglicans. So when the Irish came to the United States in great numbers, they were seen as blacks. Now, they came to the United States where there were a great number of blacks, of African Americans. This was not just a challenge to the Irish, but to all Americans, because the question, as the industrialized century took off, was who would get the jobs. And a lot of the jobs at the lowest end of the scale fell to the most recent immigrants. And so the Irish, who were the most recent immigrants, to separate themselves from the African Americans, to maintain the viability of their American experience, developed something called minstrelsy. The Christie Minstrels, an Irish troupe, were the first minstrels in the United States. And the initial nature of minstrelsy was essentially black troops in a very formalized way. They had a line, and there were various character types making fun of African Americans, showing African Americans as licentious, lazy, to be laughed at. Now keep in mind that there was no political correctness at the time, and immigrants were often quick to make fun of themselves before somebody else could make fun of them. This is a theme that is found in the last 200 years in America. But minstrelsy was remarkable in that it was the first American form of popular theater. Minstrelsy was wholly American. Before that, you had the British music hall traditions, you had Viennese waltz traditions, you had all sorts of different musical traditions that came from Europe. Minstrelsy was American. There wasn't a lot of American popular music. What would American popular music have been? It would have been Yankee Doodle, I hate to say it, but that was a hit song, Yankee Doodle. After that, of course, came Stephen Foster, the great American composer. And Stephen Foster was revolutionary in that he wrote about African Americans in a humanized way. When you think about Old Folks at Home, Camptown Races, the songs he wrote, they, unlike minstrelsy, treated African Americans humanely. But he was more of an aberration than a sign of what popular culture was in the 19th century. Stephen Foster died completely broke in New York City at the end of the 19th century or the start of the 20th, I don't remember, because he didn't collect on the songs. He couldn't get royalties on his songs. So if he wrote Oh Susanna, anybody in this room could have put together the sheet music on Oh Susanna and sold it and not paid Stephen Foster a penny. He died literally broke, and I like to say it's because he had the misfortune of writing hit songs before the Jews invented the music business. It sounds funny, but it's true. Because one of the things the Jews invented was song publishing, the publishing business. It was a penny's business, but it was invented by Jewish songwriters. We have to step back a little bit to see how these Jewish songwriters came about. By and large, they came about at the end of the 19th century with the great waves of immigration from the Pale of Settlement in the 1880s. And we all know the story of the pogroms and how the Tsar needed to get rid of the Jews. And so the Jews came to the United States. More than 2 million Jews came to the United States between 1880 and 1920, when the immigration was curtailed. The largest single pocket of poverty in the world was the Lower East Side of New York. And there's a wonderful little story that's kind of a metaphor for the relationship of the Jewish narrative and the theme of social justice in the United States. And the story is this. In the 1880s, the French sculptor Auguste Bertholdi created this statue, which we now call the Statue of Liberty, as a gift from the people of France to the people of the United States. It was shipped over in boxes and pieces to the United States, and it was supposed to be a symbol of the friendship between the French and the Americans. Now, when you think about it, what was the friendship based on? It wasn't based on social justice. It was based on a very limited form of democracy. Limited how? If you were not a man, if you were not Caucasian, if you didn't own property, there was no social justice for you. You didn't vote in the United States. You were on the outside. So it wasn't about social justice. It was about the freedom to extend your reach economically, but also religiously, as far as you were able to. And that was the core of the United States experience up until a particular point. And I like to anchor that point in this event. In the 1880s, when the waves of Jewish immigrants were coming and landing on the piers of the Lower East Side, literally looking like refuse. When you see pictures, you see just rags, and there are people in there. There was a young Jewish girl whose family came many years before. In fact, she could trace her history back to the first boatload of Jews who came to the United States in the 17th century, from out of Brazil and around through Jamaica, and of course they came to New Amsterdam, where they were not allowed to get off the boat, and they sat there for a while, and eventually the Dutch didn't want them back. They wound up going into New York, and they became established in the American society. These Jews, some 60 Jews, became very successful, and this young girl was a granddaughter of those Jews. So she was very comfortably American, and yet when she walked on the piers of the Lower East Side and saw these huddled masses there, something happened inside of her, and she thought to herself, "There but for the grace of God go I." Now, at the time, they had to raise money for the Statue of Liberty, because we got the statue, but there was no place to put it. The island that the Statue of Liberty is on, and the pedestal that it's on, was created by donations from ordinary people, 10 cents, 15 cents, 20 cents. And so there were a lot of fundraisers. And this little girl, for one of these fundraisers, wrote a poem. And the long and the short of it is, of course, the poem is the poem that is now at the base of the Statue of Liberty, which is, "Give me, you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor, the tempest tossed." Emma Lazarus, this little Jewish girl, codified American social justice. Before that, America was not necessarily about social justice. As I say, it was about many things. But this idea as a home for the outcasts of the world, that's a Jewish dream. That's part of a Jewish narrative that has become insinuated into the American narrative. So when you consider what America has become through its popular culture, particularly in the 20th century, and it could be films, it could be books, it could be music, this underlying theme of social justice, I maintain, is a Jewish dream. And so when I look back on the 20th century, I don't just see that that Jews were searching for America. I see that America was searching for its Jews, that the Jews created America in a fundamental way. So that's the background for this Jewish experience of popular culture in America, which we can start in many places. We can start with an article that appeared in the Forward, the Fovitz, in 1907 about this American sport called baseball. It was written there because the editors of the Forward wanted these Jewish immigrants to know something about America, and a man named Alfred von Tilsa read the article, and you know, back then, writing a song was a lot like selling a newspaper on a corner. There was no radio, there were no records. People literally stood on the corner and sang a song. It was called busking, or it's called busking today. He didn't know anything about baseball, von Tilsa, but he wrote the song that we still sing today, Take Me Out to the Ball Game. And if you listen to the lyrics of that song, it's not so much about baseball. He says, I don't care if I never come home. It's not about baseball. It's about something else. It's a very Jewish take on baseball. So when you consider the songwriting business at the turn of the 20th century, it's being created by a lot of very ordinary Jewish people from the Pale of Settlement. There wasn't a professional class of songwriters as developed later. There were people who, again, it was a penny's business. Von Tilsa and his brother Harry von Tilsa were one of the first Jewish songwriters to create their own publishing company. And this was, again, for a piece of sheet music, you paid a few pennies, and some of that went to the writer of the song, and so it became a business. One of the young men who followed the von Tilsers was Israel Belin, Irving Berlin, of course. Irving Berlin came to the United States as a 6-year-old boy. It's contested where he came from. The best guess is Siberia. His only memory before he was in the United States was watching his house burn, sitting on the side of a road and watching the Cossacks burn down the house. He came to the United States. He grew up in a family where his father was a cantor. He was bar mitzvahed at 13, and then his father died. And he didn't want to be a burden on his family, on his mother and his sisters. So he moved out of the house and lived on the streets of New York. And what he did was he got a job as a singing waiter in a restaurant and gradually wrote a song or two. Now, Irving Berlin has written some of the most magnificent songs of the American experience, including God Bless America, including White Christmas, Easter Parade, Always. Not so many Jewish songs. He did write one specifically Jewish song. It's called Cohen Owes Me $97. It was not a hit, did not sell well, but you've got to write a lot of songs to write some hits. You know, and they're not all hits. They're not all hits. But his first big hit, huge hit, was a song called Alexander's Ragtime Band. Alexander's Ragtime Band, 1911, was a phenomenon, not just in the United States, but around the world. There really wouldn't even be an equivalent today. What's interesting about this hit song is where it came from. It came from a young man, 15 years out of Siberia. Now you think about it, I've been trying to learn Spanish for 15 years and I can barely order dinner. This guy comes out of Siberia, and within 15 years he's writing a song in perfect American slang. That is one of the major innovations Irving Berlin gave us. He wrote a song in the language people spoke, American slang. Up until then, it was Gilbert and Sullivan, very formal language, formal English language. So the song he wrote, Alexander's Ragtime Band, was very American in terms of the vocabulary. But it was also American in terms of how it was situated. Alexander at the time was the code word for an African American. So this song was about an African American. Ragtime was a kind of music that at that point came out of Sedalia, Missouri. It was a piano playing idiom. And originally, rag was a verb, not a noun. To rag meant to improvise on a theme. Just like jazz originally was a verb, not a noun, with a different meaning. So Irving Berlin could not play piano well. He certainly couldn't play ragtime. In fact, he only played on the black keys of the piano. This is kind of ironic when you consider that he wrote this song dedicated to black musicians in a funny kind of way. But just as he incorporated American street slang, he incorporated the idea and the imagery of African Americans into the first huge hit song of the 20th century. So we start the century with this connection of blacks and Jews. Now, this was a time when popular culture and popular music, you have to think of it almost as the primal substance from which things are formed. It was a very ragtag situation, as I said before. In the vaudeville theater, which was, of course, preceded by the Yiddish theater, it was wild and loose, not like we think of theater today. The Yiddish theater, which came out of Odessa, Russia, originally, was like if we had this room full of people and we were going to have a theatrical performance, if you remembered part of the Haftorah of your bar mitzvah, you'd come up here and you'd say that. And if you had a joke, as Simone had, she'd come up and tell her joke. And the people in the audience would be there eating their lunch, and children would be running around, and they'd be hollering and throwing things and carrying on. It would go on all day long. That's how the Yiddish theater started. That's actually the roots of Broadway, but that's a different story. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, the Jews, who had come from the Pale of Settlement, were referring to the spate of lynchings that they read about in the South as pogroms. The Jews were starting to frame their experience in terms of the African American experience, and vice versa. Keep in mind, when the African American slaves came to the United States, they came from oral traditions. Nothing was written down. So when they came to America and their language wasn't preserved, they lost their history. They lost their history. But when they were put in the churches, and the churches were so important, it was the only time in their lives that they could have some respite from the hardships, they heard the story of the Exodus. That became the narrative for African Americans of their experience in slavery, the Jewish experience. So, just as the Jews came, and keep in mind, when the Jews came to the United States, the turn of the 20th century, they were not considered white. They were not considered white. They were considered Oriental. They were considered sort of black. If you look at Henry Ford's articles in the Dearborn Independent, very clearly there was a conflation of the Jewish experience and the black experience, and it went both ways. Ford accused the Jews of promoting black music to undermine the morals of America's youth. He was right, but for the wrong reasons. The Jews were absolutely promoting the black experience, but not to undermine the morals of anybody. They were doing it because of their great love for popular culture. There is inherent in the Jewish experience a love for popular culture. That's, in fact, the heart of the Jewish experience. What is it if not that all people are equal? What is it if not I have a relationship to my God, you have a relationship to your God? We're equal in our relationship to our God. There's nobody between us and our God. It's the definition of popular sovereignty. So the Jews were very much inclined to see black Americans as part of their own experience. And keep in mind also that African Americans were completely American. Nobody was more American than an African American. They'd been here the longest. They had experienced all of America. And here were these Jews from the Pale of Settlement who had never been part of any country. They had always been outside. And the great opportunity when they came to America was finally to be inside. Finally to be inside. Who did they turn to? The people closest to them, the African Americans. That's the experience that in some ways they modeled on. Now, it's not that the Jews considered themselves black. No, of course not. It's that the Jews came with this narrative. The people of the book came with a story. The story was very powerful. And when they got to America, the story included, and in many ways was about, African Americans. So that's the setup. That's my setup for how we enter popular music in the 20th century. It's the relationship of blacks and Jews starts building and building. After the first generation of songwriters like Irving Berlin, Berlin was a genius. He was gifted. He didn't study. Came people like George Gershwin. Gershwin was a second generation. He was born in the United States. I guess that would make him first generation. A very talented piano player whose dream was to write serious music. And he did that, of course, in American in Paris, Rhapsody in Blue. He wrote serious music. But he also wrote popular music. And he, as a young man, dropped out of school and started going up to Harlem to see the great stride piano players like James P. Johnson and Willie the Lion Smith. Willie the Lion Smith, a great character in the history of American music. If you don't know about him, it's fun to Google him and see. He was actually a member of a synagogue in Harlem and considered himself Jewish, as not a few African Americans did in the music business throughout the 20th century. A great piano player who taught Gershwin a great deal about the idioms of the blues. Now, a lot of people say that, well, of course the Jews and blacks had a synergy when it came to music because of the minor scale. The minor, the black music is the blues, it's a minor scale. Jewish music is a minor scale. The similarity. That's a little facile. You can't actually say it's a minor scale. There's minor music all over the world. What there is, the Jews refer to it as krekt, the crack of the voice, the moan, right? There's that. We refer to that as vocalized tone. In Western classical music, the idea is you sing a note as purely as you can. There's the note. In the blues, it's considered elegant to come up from under the note and go over the note and settle on the note. Well, we know that from how cantors sing also. So there's that. There's vocalized tone. But there's also something that's called writing Jewish. I didn't make this up. Cole Porter made this up. Cole Porter was one of the few very successful songwriters during the 30s who was not Jewish. And he said in order to become successful, he had to learn how to write Jewish. He never defined what he meant by that. People assumed it was he had to learn how to write in a minor key. That's not really it. What it is, and if I only had a keyboard here, I could show you, but I'll say something now, and if you're interested, you can follow this up later. Inside every minor scale is a major scale, and vice versa. Inside every major scale is a minor scale. The only difference between a minor scale and a major scale is the note in your left hand, the root note. So if I play a row of 8 notes in my right hand, and it's a C major scale, if I have a C in the bass, it's a C major scale. If I have an A in the bass, it's an A minor scale. There's no difference between major and minor, and this is the Jewish move. This contextualizing of happiness in terms of sadness. There's no light without dark, right? It's Havdalah. It's a Jewish concept. The Jews are not interested in the answer. The Jews are asking the question constantly. We heard this yesterday as well. Constant questioning, constant questioning. When you say the Jews are the people of the book, I like to think the book isn't the Torah, the book is the Talmud. The question on top of the question on top of the question. It's not about the answer. I don't think Jews want the answer. I really don't. Okay, so now consider, as we're moving through the modern century, in the 30s, for example, you have the first socially conscious popular song written by Yip Harburg. It's called Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? Brother, Can You Spare a Dime was the first song that was written from out of the mouth of an American who was suffering. It's the first song of social justice. Yip Harburg became famous a few years later for not only writing the lyrics, but the entire middle section of The Wizard of Oz, in the land of the Munchkins. That whole play, all that dialogue was written by Yip Harburg. Next time you consider The Wizard of Oz, consider it as a Jewish metaphor. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. By the 30s, you find the Jews in popular music specifically reaching out to black Americans. You find Benny Goodman breaking the color barrier by hiring African American players, Teddy Wilson. You find the experience of Yip Harburg. But first among equals was a man named Milt Gabler. Milt Gabler worked in his father's appliance store in New York. It was the Colony appliance store. The store sold radios, record players by then had come out. And to attract customers into his father's store, Milt, who was a bit of a jazz fan, put a speaker from a radio up in the window above the front door and played jazz music into the street. And people came in asking for, do you have that music? Well, it wasn't a record store. But Milt Gabler had this idea, because during the 30s, the major record labels stopped recording what they called race music. Race music wasn't just black music. Race music was any ethnic music. Back then, they did German music for the Germans, they would have done Yiddish music for the Jews, they would have done Irish music for the Irish. When the Depression hit, the record companies, the major record companies, just backed off of it. So the music that Milt Gabler loved was no longer available. So he went to the major record companies and said, he licensed the music. He said, I'll give you a couple pennies if you sell me your 78s that you haven't been able to sell. He started that way. He sold them all. It was the first independent record label in the United States. It was a mail order business also, first mail order business. And he did so well, he went back to the record companies and he said, I'll tell you what, instead of selling me the 78s, let me manufacture the 78s and I'll pay you a little bit of that. They said, fine. Next thing you know, he had a successful company. Well, suddenly the big companies looked around and said, well, that's money we could be making. They stopped licensing their music to Milt Gabler, so Milt Gabler said, fine, I'll record my own music. And he did, and he started a record label. And it became wildly successful in the jazz idiom. If that was all that he had done, it would have been fantastic, the first independent record label, because over the next 20 years, a string of street-smart Jews started dozens of very important independent record labels that preserved and distributed African American music. It's like talking about the 12 tribes of Israel, when you talk about Hi Weiss and Sid Nathan and Jerry Wexler and all these characters. Milt Gabler was the first Jewish entrepreneur to focus on the black music experience. And the breakthrough event for Milt Gabler was with a song called Strange Fruit. You all know Strange Fruit as the song that made Billie Holiday an icon. Billie Holiday, over the years, claimed variously that she wrote the song, that the song was written for her, that she discovered the song. None of that was true. Strange Fruit was written by a Jewish schoolteacher named Abe Mirapol, and he brought the song to Milt Gabler, and he wanted Milt Gabler to bring the song to Billie Holiday, and when Milt Gabler did, she refused to record it. She refused several times to record it. Finally, she was convinced to record the song, and of course it became an icon of the 20th century African-American experience. Now, this is an example of how on a business level, blacks and Jews by the 30s were indispensable to one another. And we'll see through the 40s and 50s this continues. But I want to give you a little insight into another level at which this happened. And that is, as I mentioned before, often black musicians learned a little Yiddish. They would play at Jewish events. Jews would play at black clubs. There was a social level too, not just a business level. And perhaps that's even deeper, because when you consider the business relationships, it gets very contentious very quickly. The Jewish record label owners are accused of not paying the black musicians proper royalties, which was true. But they also didn't pay white musicians proper royalties. They didn't pay anybody proper royalties. That's what the business was then. But it's contentious, obviously. But here's another level that we have to consider this relationship. And again, it's anchored to a story within a story. The story on the outside is the story of Louis Armstrong, a young boy, 6 years old, an orphan, essentially. His father was missing. His mother was missing. And the story goes that he was taken to the Little Waifs orphanage in New Orleans, where he was given a trumpet, and the rest is history. He became the most famous American jazz musician, the father of jazz, really. It's a beautiful story. It is not true. The truth is, this little 6-year-old boy was standing on a corner in New Orleans, and a junk wagon pulled up. A junk wagon owned by the Karnofsky family. And they put this little boy on the junk wagon. They gave him a little tin horn to blow to attract people. And that was Louis Armstrong's first horn. But more than that, they took Louis Armstrong home and included him in Friday night dinner. And Louis Armstrong would come to say eventually that his first memory of music was listening to Mrs. Karnofsky sing the Russian lullaby to the children. And he said what really got his attention was how badly the Jews were being treated and how kindly they treated one another. And then he went on to say, if only blacks could learn this from the Jews. So, on a very emotional and a personal level, the Jews were providing a narrative for African Americans. Okay, so by the time you get to the 1940s, you have a plethora of these little labels. Of course, you have Jewish musicians, you have, as I pointed out, Jewish songwriters, and by then you have Broadway theater that's very much to the point of this discussion. For example, you have Jerome Kern's Showboat, a classic, perhaps the first classic American Broadway musical. What's it about? The curtain comes up and there's a levee, and a stage full of black Americans are singing about Old Man River. And Old Man River, of course, is a metaphor for the American experience. It keeps rolling along. Jerome Kern, a Jewish songwriter. But by the 40s, we have these labels. And by the 40s, we have a mature record business. And by the 40s, we have radio play. And we have a business that's starting to percolate a little bit. It's a business. Before that, nobody would want their child to be a professional musician unless it was a classical musician. Certainly not to be involved in popular music. Popular music, up until the 50s, the turn of the century, with the exception, of course, of a star like Benny Goodman. The most unlikely image, I think, of the 20th century is this bar mitzvah bocher with his glasses and his clarinet playing for screaming teenage girls, and they're throwing their underwear at him. What must he have thought? But with a few exceptions, Artie Shaw being another one, there are some exceptions. It wasn't really a business. You know, you'd see these musicians, they'd be dressed so nicely with their ties. They're sleeping on a bus, literally. They ride on a bus for 6 hours, they get out, they play a job, they get back on the bus, they ride for 6 hours. That's not a life. Nobody would want that. But by the 50s, it was becoming a business. A lot of things actually happened in the 50s that changed the story about popular music and blacks and Jews. Of course, one of the major things was World War II. I was too young to remember, but I have read somewhere that Saul Bellow said that Jews, American Jews by and large, were culpable in the 40s because they didn't want to know the truth of the Holocaust. And he said that he himself felt guilty that he didn't go out of his way to learn more about what was going on. But keep in mind that when the Jews came to America, they couldn't join white shoe law firms. They couldn't go to Ivy League colleges. They couldn't participate in a lot of the American experience. But by the 1950s, they were gradually starting to be able to do these things. What was one of the early signs of the 50s of this new Americanization of the Jews? Nose jobs. Nose jobs took over everybody. How many people here? Of course. So, the Jews were becoming American for the first time. But don't think of it that way. The Jews were becoming white. The Jews were no longer being considered black. They were considered white, part of white Caucasian America. So if they did not run to find out the truth of what was going on in Europe, it's understandable. But just as the Jews who started these little record labels focused on documenting and distributing African American music. And I like to say, okay, some of these guys were not good guys. Some of them were great guys. There's a man named Alfred Lyons who started Blue Note Records. And Blue Note Records was the first great jazz record label, and also probably the last great jazz record label. And he did many things that were revolutionary, that promoted black artists. For example, he was the first man that put pictures of the actual artist on the cover of the record. Before that, there'd be drawings and artwork. You'd never see a black face on the cover of a record unless it was a blues record or race record. He gave credit to the musicians. He was an honest and an honorable man. But there were a lot of guys who were not so honest and not so honorable, like I mentioned High Weiss. High Weiss got in the record business because he had a business that was an injection molding business. He made toilet seats. And after World War II, he found that the same machines that could make toilet seats could make records. There you go. He was not a particularly gracious man. But he did preserve a lot of important culture. So you have to allow that sometimes bad people can do good work. But what the Jews gradually became was culture brokers. They found themselves in between Black America and WASP America, and they were able to translate one to the other. Just as Henry Ford accused the Jews of doing, they continued to do that. They continued to deliver black music to all of America. An example in the 50s are the songwriters Lieber and Stoller, who wrote these popular songs like Charlie Brown, but they contextualized black experience in a human way that white Americans could understand, and also that black Americans could understand. It was similar if you look back on the Jews' relationship to minstrelsy. When the Jews came to the United States and minstrelsy was popular, the Jews got into minstrelsy. Al Jolson was perhaps the most famous minstrel. But what he did when he performed a song like Mammy, Mammy was about motherhood. It was about family. It wasn't about being drunk and falling around. The Jews, when they got involved with minstrelsy, suddenly it was a way to talk about home and family. Again, this penchant for social justice. Well, the same thing happened in the 50s when these Jewish songwriters got involved with rock and roll music. When you look at rock and roll, there aren't many Jewish faces. They tend to be Southern Baptist faces. Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, whoever. Where were the Jews? The Jews were writing all the songs. They wrote all the songs. And I like to even mention this because it's so far out. I haven't looked into it because I don't want to be disappointed. But Elvis Presley, toward the end of his life, wore a chai around his neck because his mother's mother was Jewish. And apparently he identified, to some extent, as Jewish. But that's neither here nor there. In the 50s, you have popular music, rock and roll music, being about, essentially, young American boys and girls. I mean, what's rock and roll about? It's about a boy and a girl. It's what American music has always been about. It's what Gershwin wrote about. It's what Irving Berlin wrote about in Always. It's what Jerome... I mean, when you think about popular music, what is it? It's about a boy and a girl. I find that to be very spiritual, and I'll tell you why. And again, I think it's a very Jewish thing. When you look at popular music in the 19th century, and you look at Gilbert and Sullivan, it's about kings and queens and the admiral of the Queen's Navy. It's not about normal people. The Jews started writing about everyday people. And why is it important when you write about love? Because the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. Love is about caring. And caring is the heart of Tikkun Olam, to heal a broken world. And when you have a boy and a girl holding hands, what you have is a small shard of caring, a little tiny piece of caring, which is at the heart of the American song tradition, and it's something that the Jews inserted. So when you're in the 50s and you hear these songs about he's a rebel and he drove off and he did this, a song that pretends to be about juvenile delinquents, at the heart of it is this little thing of caring. So even as the Jews were were culture brokering the black experience, they were inserting a little Jewish DNA into the popular music. By the time we get to the 60s, things have changed dramatically. On the one hand, you have white middle class. Well, let's go back. 60, 61, 62. The main experience, social experiment, you could call it, were the freedom rides. It was all about going to the South and organizing for social justice. An overwhelming proportion of the kids who went to the South were Jewish. And of course, we all know about Andy Goodman and Mickey Schwerner, the two Jewish boys who were killed down there in the 60s. The blacks and the Jews in the early part of the 60s were as close together in a way as a family could be. It was a social experience much like Louis Armstrong experienced back in New Orleans. There was a oneness to the experience. In a way, it almost presaged the inevitability of the split between blacks and Jews, which occurred by the end of the 60s. Going into the 60s, you had young musicians like a young guitar player from Chicago named Michael Bloomfield, brilliant guitar player, who went down to the South Side and fell in with Muddy Waters and all these great rural black blues musicians who had come to Chicago and had been recorded by the Chess Brothers, a couple of Jewish entrepreneurs who started Chess Records. And he was in many ways raised, his father was a very successful Jewish businessman on the North Shore of Chicago. And his father was very disappointed in him because he loved music and his father wanted him to be involved in business. And so Muddy Waters and some of these black musicians became his surrogate parents. It's a wonderful story. And later in the decade, he became responsible for these black musicians going to California and playing at Bill Graham's Fillmore Auditorium, which gave them visibility throughout the United States, and many of them became quite successful beyond the little blues community. But you also have Bob Dylan, the Jewish boy from Hibbing, Minnesota. And I think we can see, by the time Dylan comes along, something dramatic has happened in the relationship of blacks and Jews. In 1968, there was a moment when it was clear that blacks and Jews were no longer singing the same song. Something happened. And to me, it's the most tragic moment of the American 20th century because African Americans and Jews, first of all, as I say, they're at the heart of American popular culture, but more than that, in many ways, they're the soul of the American experience. And I'm not paranoid, but I can't help but think that there have always been people and forces in the United States that very much wanted blacks and Jews to be at each other's throats, just like there are forces in the world that very much want Jews and Arabs to be at each other's throats. But in any case, in 1968, many things happened. One of them was there was a conference of radio programmers in Miami, Florida. And they were going to honor a man named Jerry Wexler. Now this conference was, the theme of the conference was the importance of black music in America. And Jerry Wexler, a Jewish producer, had produced Aretha Franklin and many other black artists. And the records he made were authentic, revolutionary, and he was very proud of his relationship to African American musicians. He, in fact, when he worked at a music publication called Cashbox, came up with the term rhythm and blues. Before that, black music was called race music. Rhythm and blues, a more humane way to approach this music. So he was going to be honored. And he was planning to tell the story. I mean, he also produced Ray Charles. I mean, great black musicians came up through his tutelage. He was going to tell the story of how when he recorded Aretha Franklin in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and the album became an iconic record for black America. Aretha Franklin was the only black person in the studio. All the musicians were white rural. And he was so proud that they played as one, that the music trumped skin color. He went down there to receive his award, and suddenly he was attacked on all sides by militant black hustlers, really, who were saying the radio stations should pay us reparations. Jerry Wexler, you should pay us reparations. Jerry Wexler left that conference and sold his share in the record company and got out of the business. It was a great turning point. But that's not the only thing that drove a wedge in the relationship between blacks and Jews. Affirmative action has been cited as a wedge. Why? Well, because Jews coming out of World War II particularly were very hesitant to single out one class of people for any reason. I mean, affirmative action singled out a class of people. Well, the Jews had been singled out, and not to good effect. So there's that. There's the rise of the whole Black Power movement, and something that Tom Wolfe referred to as Mau-Mauing the flak catchers. We'll just let that sit there. There was the war in Vietnam. I don't think people have talked about this so much. The war in Vietnam changed the dialogue. Before that, as I say, we were focused on the freedom rides. We were focused on social justice. The war in Vietnam, suddenly, you have Jews who were now at all the major universities, totally American, didn't think of themselves as Jews particularly, and were not going to go to Vietnam. The anti-war movement, the SDS movement, a lot of it was driven by middle-class, radical Jews. The war separated educated whites / Jews from poor whites and blacks who went to Vietnam. The Jewish narrative, as we know it, couldn't hold any longer because the war raised the stakes. Before, it was possible to be an idealist if you were young and Jewish. But when Vietnam came along, they wanted you. They were going to take you to Vietnam. Suddenly, it wasn't about, I'm going down to Selma. It's about, do I have to go to Canada? And at this moment, you can hear it in the music. On the one hand, you have Bob Dylan, the voice of the educated Jewish person. All about the story, the narrative, the myth, something larger than the facts on the ground. And on the other hand, you have James Brown. James Brown never wrote a lyric that mattered in his life, but the sound of his voice was more important than most of the songs that were written. You have meaning and you have sound, and the two split. And the rest of the century, that's the way the music went. It turned into gangster rap, and it turned into the business of the music business. Today they refer to American Jewish experience as post-ethnic. Post-ethnic means you can choose to be Jewish if you want. You don't have to. You might not even come from a Jewish family. That's okay. You can choose to be Hispanic if you want. That's okay. There's a group out of Los Angeles called the Hip Hop Hootios. Only one person in the group is Jewish, but they claim to feel very Jewish. The Jews are experiencing a post-ethnic period now. And one of the great challenges to Jews in the 21st century is, what is Jewish anymore? I mean, if to be Jewish is going to mean you have to identify as Orthodox, as it is in Israel. I don't know if you've been reading, but now the head rabbi in Israel says he doesn't believe Reform Jews are Jews. Right? So, does that mean the only Jews in America in 50 years are going to be the Hasids? What about the rest of us? intermarriage is above 50%. What's the Jewish experience? My response to that is the Jewish experience is exactly what we're talking about. We see the Jewish experience alive in America. As I said, it's not just that the Jews were looking for America. America was looking for the Jews. There is no post-ethnic America for African Americans. They don't ever get to be white. They wear it on their skin. But will Jews continue to have a sense of their Jewishness? My sense of it is only if Jews in the future, because my son heard stories about the Holocaust, but they're just stories. I know my grandmother's people were killed. That's personal. To my son's daughter, it's just a ghost story. They're not going to define themselves in terms of the Holocaust. They're not going to define themselves in terms of Europe. They don't feel connected to Yiddish. There's a revival in Yiddish, that's very nice, but that's not who these people are. They're American. So what's Jewish about that? Everything. Thank you. Okay. Again, we entertain questions, and we're not looking for answers. Go ahead.
Hi. Enjoyed that very, very much. As long as you mentioned Yip Harburg, I thought it appropriate to mention perhaps the most subversive of all Broadway musicals, Finian's Rainbow, with Yip Harburg and Burton Lane, which actually shows a black and Irish united against the Ku Klux Klan, against racism, against capitalism, and so on. And this in a period when America was not exactly looking for that. And I would add one more thing. Minister Louis Farrakhan, who apparently was quite a good classical violinist, who had a very close relationship to his Jewish violin teacher.
Isn't that something? Any comments, questions? There's one over there. Well, to continue. Wait 1 second, she's bringing the microphone to you.
To continue his Finian's Rainbow, I agree that the Jewish and black experience, that the Jews changed America as much as America changed Judaism. Do you think that that Jews defining the American dream in film was as potent as what happened in music?
Oh, of course, absolutely. And there's a wonderful book on this subject by Milt Gabler called An Empire of Their Own, which outlines, and there's a fact in there, I'm probably going to slightly misrepresent it, but he says at one point, the head of every film studio in Hollywood, but one, came from within a few hundred miles of Warsaw, Poland.
Yeah. No, they came from like a 10-kilometer distance of each other in Japan.
There you go. Okay. Good reading. Yes.
Three things that was very enjoyable. That's number one. It was great. Number two, you mentioned Cole Porter and having to write Jewish. It's been said that some of his actual music parallels on cantorial and the liturgy. What's your opinion about that?
Well, the famous canard is Gershwin. It ain't necessarily so. They claim, people have said, of course, writing Jewish, it ain't necessarily so. No, it ain't necessarily so. Right? Baruch Adonai Hamvorah, Baruch Atah Adonai. Right? But I don't think it's on that level. We're not looking for that kind of, I took a melody from this and I put it here, and so I'm writing Jewish. I don't think that's what it is.
Secondly, being from Nashville and watched the growth of the music business, once they started a Reformed congregation which allowed mixed marriages and so forth, it's amazing how many Jewish people in the country music business, most of them producers, you know, and that type of thing. It's like a Jewish boy, as far as an athlete's concerned, is born to own the team, not play on it. It came out of the woodwork and involved in the country music, which is basically Appalachia,
Amazing.
etc.
It's amazing. It really is. And it's one of the most extraordinary things. And I don't, to this day, know quite what to make it. How this group of people that has never been more than 2% of the population of the United States, when you stand back and you look at it, it's like they've been behind 80%, 90% of the films. How is this possible? And this is something that
something so foreign to
it's fantastic. Yes, back there.
Can you say something about the still controversial relationship, personal and professional, between Fletcher Henderson and Benny Goodman?
Well, yeah, Fletcher Henderson, you know, they accused Irving Berlin, when he wrote Alexander's Ragtime Band, of having a little colored boy in the closet who actually wrote it. Not true, of course. What was controversial was that Fletcher Henderson, of course, had one of the greatest innovative black orchestras, and he was a brilliant arranger, and he went to work for Benny Goodman. But it's similar to the experience of Duke Ellington and, help me out, who wrote?
For a white person or black person?
Billy Strayhorn, thank you. The relationship of Billy Strayhorn and Ellington, you know, you have arrangers who for years have contributed to this music and have not gotten credit. And it goes on today. You know, Quincy Jones is known as this great arranger, but he hasn't done any arranging in 20 years. He hires people to do it. So yeah, that absolutely happened. And Fletcher's band was more sophisticated than Benny's, and there it is. Yeah. Yes, sir.
There are a great number of new arrivals coming in this country all the time who have really difficult, you know, times and places, from Latin America, Somalians, the Hmong, etc. Are any of the Jewish songwriters, publishers, in any way connected with explaining their narrative into American society?
Well, there is a connection, not a great one, between the Hispanic ascendancy in America today and the Jewish business. There's a guy named Josh Norick out in LA who's very involved in Latin alternative music, and because I think there is a deep connection between Jews and, you know, Latin culture, and always has been. The Jews started the mambo craze in the 50s, you know, I mean, but the music business today, it's difficult to tease out the Jewish threads of it because it's so corporate. And just like it's difficult now to tease out the Jewish threads in many things, it's very difficult to say that in the music business today there's, as he said, a Jewish presence beyond they own the companies or they own stock in the companies.
Why is that? I mean, why have we lost, or are you saying we've lost the social consciousness that you immediately addressed earlier with respect to the new arrivals rather than, you know, the people that came from Europe?
Well, the question is, why aren't there more Jews in the record business today? Have we lost our social consciousness as a people? Well, you know, if I said that one of the turning points was when Jews became white in the 50s and became American in the 50s and started to look like Rock Hudson in the 50s, then they're subject to all the ills of America, and one of the greatest is the illness of greed and the illness of avarice. And what we see today is all about money and very little about anything else, and it's how the politicians operate today. And, you know, an election today isn't about ideas, it's about hundreds of millions of dollars. So why should the Jews be outside of that? Back then.
My question is, the urban legend of Louis Armstrong's origins. How do you know about the Karnofsky family, and why do you think that legend sort of developed? Because it fed into, well, I don't know. I'm asking you the question. Why you think that's what I'm wondering about?
Right. It's something that was hiding in plain sight. Why the legend? Because that was the story that people wanted to tell. Because it fit the discussion of the black artist being a full-blown expression of their experience in America. I got that story from Louis Armstrong's autobiography, Hiding in Plain Sight. There it was. He talked about the Karnofsky family. He talked about the importance. He talked about the importance of davening to his singing style. And this was not that unusual, really. There was a period where the relationship of blacks and Jews in America, in the music business particularly, was so intimate that this was more typical than less typical. But by the time people started talking about this historically, I think it was de rigueur to say that the black experience is an elevated experience that we don't know anything about, and look at Louis Armstrong. It makes you think that, maybe 80-90% of the received wisdom is not true.
So this is the last question.
Last question, okay.
On public television, there were several shows about Jews in show business in America and so on. And what I got from that was that they were more, and it seems to apply here, they were more successful in newer areas where, like movies and other recording, where there wasn't an establishment there already, and they were able to do that.
Yeah. Well, it's because, they were kept out of a lot of areas. So, for example, when you consider how the Jews got into the music business or the film business, it wasn't their love of music or film, it was opportunities. So one of my favorite stories is how the Jews got into the business of film. They started in the rag business. Why were they involved in the rag business? Because in the Pale of Settlement, they weren't allowed to sell retail clothing. They could only take rags and resell them, right? So when they came to the United States, that's the skill they had. They had the needle trade, and simultaneously there was technology. Somebody had invented a sewing machine. So you have pictures of these Jews on the Lower East Side while they're all walking around carrying a sewing machine. And within 10 years of the Jews coming, they had invented exact size clothing. Before that, there was, large and nothing. And so everybody can look good, but more than that, they opened up retail clothing stores. But more than that, when these moviolas came along, they had these retail spaces. They put some moviolas into the retail spaces to entertain their customers. But the moviolas got so popular, they moved out the clothing, they put in more moviolas, and they started charging people nickels to come and see the movies. And then Edison wouldn't make more movies for them, so they got as far away from Edison as they could. They went to Hollywood, and they started making movies. This is how the Jews got in the film business, through rags.
Listen, friends, one of them, he got his money because his mother invented the first stove where the mouth of the fox
The mouth of the fox.
And that's how he got most of his money. And along with that retail business, went out to California. Was it Carl Lammel? And started, I think it was 20th Century Fox. Who was that? Carl, I think it was Lammel.
Who started 20th Century Fox.
20th Century Fox. Fox.
And listen, let me take a moment, and as the granddaughter of someone who made their money in the schmata business,
Yes.
let's take a moment and really thank Ben Sidran
Thank you.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you.